don't know if everyone can see me sitting down here, but yeah, that would be good, yeah. So, yeah, thank you, first of all, Fatima and Louise, for inviting us into your home and to do this whole lecture series. It's a real privilege for anyone working in design, writing, curating, and any facet of it to be able to talk about something that they're passionate about, and we've had the freedom to do that, which is really nice. So I'm a curator and a writer, as we explained, but the topic I'm going to talk about today comes from something that I've been investigating journalistically. So I wrote an article for Icon that's in the current issue of Icon about design education and the crisis in the UK that we currently are facing, where there's a real decline in students taking up design generally, but particularly design and technology as a subject in itself. So that's my reasoning. It's not, I'm not an expert in design education. I'm speaking from the perspective of a journalist and from my own research and interviews that I've done. I'm also only limiting the conversation to school age at the moment. So when first investigating, what's been written and said about design education, there's a lot about universities. Everyone has an opinion on how design schools should be run, what students should learn. But schools, to me, are more interesting because they're the point of learning where everybody can embrace design and technology before having made a decision, or perhaps being influenced or finding out they already have an aptitude for design and technology. It's the one exposure to the subject that we all have to have, and we all can relate to because we all have had some kind of experience in it. So also the talk is mostly about state schools, in fact entirely about state schools. So I've excluded private schools from the conversation again because I'm trying to talk about the mass, the factors that are affecting most people and most learners in the UK. And they are mostly UK examples. So I talk a little bit about examples from abroad later on, but obviously it's a system that I know best, so that tends to be who I spoke to. But that's not to say there aren't more wonderful examples from elsewhere, it's just these are the ones that I've managed to pack into the lecture. So I apologise for the first slide looking so boring, but I promise they get better. But, this is the starkness of it. So this first table is looking at the drop in entries to GCSE design and technology between 2014 and 2019, and it might be too small for you to see, but it's 55.3% in just those years. But actually the problem is actually there's been a decline over 20 years, and this is a long-standing problem. So it's not just, within somebody's kind of part of their schooling, it's a whole generation who may not have had any design teaching in school. So we have this problem in the UK, but then on the other hand, we have this knowledge that actually there's huge growth in the creative economy. So there are creative jobs. It's one of the sectors which is due to grow double the rate of any other job in the sector between now and 2024. So we have this booming economy, and we have this real decline in people taking up the subject. So what we're looking at is this huge gap, a generational gap, between people studying design and being able to work in design. So why? Well, it's down to a mixture of things. One of them is school funding cuts. So we're now 10 years into state schools having their funding consistently eroded by successive governments, and obviously when you're facing cuts, design, it tends to be one of the things that goes out the window first, because design teaching the way it is at the moment requires workshop facilities, it requires machinery, it requires technicians, specialist expertise. So that then leads to a lack of teachers who are training in design. There's also a cultural aspect. There's a long-standing failure to recognise design as a valued subject. And we in the UK have this heavily exam-based system where we have a results-orientated culture of kids learning a certain subject and then being tested on it, which design doesn't lend itself to. And actually the government's kind of recommendations for what kids should study at school, design has not been recognised as one of the core subjects, so the core subjects being English and maths and more academic subjects. So teaching design generally as a singular subject is also problematic. To try and teach design already falls into two areas of the curriculum, so art and design and technology. But it fits across lots of categories, obviously. So design is this constantly morphing, evolving thing, and to try and teach it as a singular subject sort of is a bit problematic anyway. And also the current curriculum that's taught in schools began in the 1980s, and it's been patched up, so there have been attempts to kind of change it, mould it, fit it with how design itself is changing, but there's never been a wholesale rethink of how design needs to change to kind of fit the 21st century. It's still a kind of 20th century skills-based mindset. And if you think about what designers do now, they don't just make products. Service design is growing, experience design is growing, and learning how to make a kind of bird box in DTE is not really going to help you with that. So what are we facing as a consequence of this decline? Well, as I mentioned, a generation with no school-age exposure to design at all. Design's really good for teaching project-based learning rather than subject-based learning. And again, the Creative Industries Federation tells us that these are the skills the workplace requires. So when we get to work, we are hardly working for ourselves. We're always working in teams or with partners. We're working to deadlines. We're working on projects which require knowledge from lots of different parts of our brain to be able to solve problems. So actually, design's one of those crucial things that you can learn early, which sort of equips you for that. We're also facing a generation who has little experience of hands-on making and fixing and no understanding of the value of craft. So unless you're from a kind of family background, which is teaching you those values, or it's part of your home life that you're making things or fixing things, then you're probably, the only way you've kind of interacted with objects is to buy them. So that's a kind of, particularly to the conversations that we're going to be having this week, I think this and the next point are kind of crucial. So also that kind of project-based learning does give kids the skills to face the global problems that require thinking across disciplines. So to kind of solve the massive problems that are going to affect us, but particularly the generation below, we're going to need to think in a completely different way, in a way that we can't really understand with our mindset and our education. It's going to have to come from the next generation. And as we see with Greta, it already is. So I spoke to several people for the article, one of them being Daniel Charney, who is the kind of co-founder of this learning program called Fix Berts. Fix Berts is more than just a learning program. It started in 2010 as a kind of way to get designers to use their skills in a kind of way that helps other people who are less able than them. But then in 2016, Fix Berts recognised that there's a real value in this way of working for schools. So it's this learning program which is to do with lots of different skills, but it can either be taught in its entirety, and Fix Berts was a part of the curriculum at one point and did lead to its own qualification. Or teachers can kind of pick lessons from it depending on what suits their own school, or they could teach it for a special event like a science week. So this is Daniel Charney saying, if the UK is talking about being a creative sector world leader and design is not being seen as the gateway to creativity, we're heading for a really rough situation, and that's kind of an understatement, I think. So this is Fix Berts being taught as part of a primary school science week. And what's crucial about Fix Berts is that it's all with really low cost materials. So you can see they're using tape and cardboard and bits of sponge. And that's because they got lots of feedback from teachers saying, we want to teach design, but we don't really have a workshop in our school. What can we do that teaches design that we can do in the classroom, that we can do in a really low cost way? And one of the sessions is about simulation. So these kids start by having some kind of restriction. So this girl has a cardboard tube around her leg, which restricts the bend in her knee. And this kid has a pencil or a lolly, it could be a lolly stick on her hand, which restricts how she can move her hand. And then her and her peers, then they have to kind of invent ways to carry on working and living and doing daily tasks with these restrictions. And the whole idea is that it teaches kids empathy, because they have to see the world from somebody else's point of view. These are physical restrictions, not kind of the kind of emotional aspects of having restricted movement, but for the sake of the lesson, they're already sort of learning how to look at the world through somebody else's eyes. So what's interesting about the fixed Berts philosophy, that is kind of, he says it's not about making more designers, it's not in order to feed the creative sector, but that is part of it. So there's lots of people thinking about how to solve this problem, and they're all coming at it from slightly different angles. So engineering is also finding itself in a bit of a crisis. Where are our engineers going to come from in the next generation? Design, should we really be encouraging more people into design to make more products and more stuff? So his point of view is that it's not about teaching design isn't about making more designers, and it's not feeding people into that kind of entrepreneurial mindset of becoming a designer, making more, being a star designer. He's trying to say that all of us benefit from some kind of design education, and the things that design teaching, whether you go on to be a designer or you go on to be anything else, design teaching has some kind of value for all of us. So I mentioned that fixed Berts was on the curriculum for a while. It actually got blocked by the government, who were facing lots of competing different learning programs. Lots of people are trying to get their agenda into schools, basically, from engineering to design, and they're all coming at it from slightly different angles. And obviously to be on the school curriculum is a huge and quite hard thing, and to stay on the curriculum is even harder. So where they found more success was to kind of train teachers in CPD sessions to kind of learn about fixed Berts and then go on and teach them in their schools if they wanted to. So I think 220 teachers are now trained to teach fixed Berts in their schools. And that kind of flexible approach has suited the fixed Berts programme better. So, there's some schools where they're special needs schools, and the fixed problems have, instead of sort of simulating disability, they've actually been helping each other because some of the kids have disabilities or learning needs. So fixed Berts actually solving problems for each other, which is quite nice, and then they can feed back ideas back to fixed Berts to say, I ran fixed Berts, this was great about it, but this wasn't great. This is how we could improve. So again, Daniel Charney talking about design competency. If you want every kid to have it, you can't teach it as a subject. So we need to not just improve the D&T in the curriculum as it is, or patch it up, but actually rethink the whole thing. And then part of Charney's frustration with fixed Berts and trying to work within this very narrow-minded school system led him to do Fixed Camp. So Fixed Camp was just like a 15-day sort of summer camp that happened in Brixton last year. And because it was outside the school kind of agenda, they could actually be a lot freer with what they wanted to explore. So it was for kids aged 9 to 14, and they could come along. They were from all sorts of backgrounds, ones who maybe already had an interest in design, and ones who perhaps didn't. These are some girls. Every session, every day started with the kids making their own tool belts. So these girls are punching their initials or their names into leather to make their own tool belt. They were learning, part of the kind of philosophy at Fixed Camp was that kids should learn traditional skills like sawing, filing, punching, whittling, but they should also be learning about new materials. So as much as they're kind of doing the traditional skills, they're also doing laser cutting, 3D printing, working with new materials as well. So that tool belt is a little kind of display of the kind of things that they might learn early on. And then part of Fixed Camp was to kind of do a big build as well. So they learned those individual skills, and then they all had to work together to kind of make to make something bigger than themselves, basically. So they had to then go outside at some point and make a big build. I have no idea what this is, but one of the big builds was a tree house that politicians could go off and learn about nature on a retreat, and they would come back with some better understanding of climate change. So actually these kids had really, they showed natural empathy, they showed concern for the kind of big topics in a way that, they weren't taught, they weren't fed these ideas, these are ideas that they came up with themselves. So the good parts about Fixed Berts, that it's promoting project-based rather than subject-based learning. Its aim is to kind of create a generation that are resourceful, empathetic, engaged with society and the environment, able to work in teams and can make and fix, crucially. And they found that variable formats work better than trying to restrict themselves to being on the curriculum. So a mixture of teacher training, camps, and giving teachers a menu of lessons so that they could choose from to suit their own schools. To provide low-cost ways of teaching design. And also Fixed Camp, they had 265 campers, I think a third were girls, and almost 30% were people from a ethnic background other than white. So again, what's crucial about looking at school-age design is that you are reaching people before they've been kind of given, got ideas from other places about what they should be doing or what they should be interested in. Some of these kids were from age 9, so they're really, you're kind of catching them when they can be interested in all sorts of things, and then that really kind of boosts who you get to be, participating in design. So the hard parts about Fixed Berts, getting on the curriculum is rightfully hard work, so you don't want anyone walking into schools and kind of pushing their agendas, because obviously all education is political. So Fixed Berts found a way around that. Breaking down the long-held values about what and how children should learn in schools is really challenging. So to kind of push project-based learning rather than subject-based learning, you're going against like centuries of people learning individual subjects. It's very, very hard to change that mindset. Change is also expensive, so the Welsh curriculum is actually moving from subject-based learning into kind of 6 core areas which cross each other, so they're less like individual silos. They're not quite as loose and phenomenon-based as other curriculums are, which we'll come to look at later. But the cost is already £44 million of doing, of kind of trying to implement change. And it sounds like a decent amount, but divided per teacher in Wales, I think it's £650 per teacher to last 3 years. So is that enough? And is that enough time to be able to change these values that we've had for so long? Also, working outside the curriculum, it relies on the enthusiasm and the energy of D&T teachers. And we know teaching is already a stressful profession. So obviously if you're on the curriculum, there's already some, the teachers aren't having to go to their heads and say, look, Fixed Berts is great, we should be teaching it to everybody. It's already there on the curriculum. Whereas right now, they're having to kind of go out, learn about it, find it for themselves, prove that it's a good thing to teach in their schools. So then the next kind of set of educators that I talked to were Matt and Fiona, who have been running these build projects. She's an educator and he's an architect, and they've been doing this since 2016. And they actually started by consulting with children on the design of their spaces. And then they kind of thought, why are we just asking kids to design the spaces? Why are we just doing the kind of classroom workshop bit, and why aren't they actually building it themselves? And Matthew Springett, who is the architect of this pair, actually went to Beam Camp in the US, which we'll come to later again, but it's a summer camp in the US which has been going for about 10 to 15 years, where kids actually physically use power tools and building and construction methods under supervision and really safely, but they actually make their own buildings, and they do like a big build every summer. So they start with a workshop, and this is for a makerspace again in Brixton that was opened for the summer last year. And the kids talk about how they want the space to be, who they want to come to the space, how they want it to be used. And then they actually build it with help. And that's the final makerspace in Brixton. So the space is for families to come and, use laser cutters and 3D printers and soldering irons and kind of tinker and invent things. And a huge part of what Fiona and Matthew want to achieve is, they started Build because they say they also recognise that we have this lack of quality teaching in UK state schools, but they're also trying to reach people that wouldn't get these opportunities. So they're often working with young carers, people who have been excluded from school, people that have special needs. So they're deliberately, or schools that are in more deprived areas. So they're really trying to seek out people that art and design wouldn't usually kind of enter their lives. And they also, a key part of why they set up Build was to give young people a say in the design of their environment. So young people use the cities and buildings as much as all of us do, but they're kind of, we can consult them on it, but they often feel like they don't have much agency in how things are run. So it was a huge part of instilling kind of giving these kids a voice, was to do these projects. So this is the modelling workshop from Phoenix School in Bow, which is a special needs school. And the school was actually moving site, so to kind of give the kids something recognisable at both sites, they wanted to build this kind of outdoor classroom / shelter. And again, they weren't just designing, they were building as well. And that's the final classroom. So I think what's cool about Build is that it's, we know kids can make stuff at a certain scale, but it's actually testing, real pieces of architecture that these kids are making quite successfully, and also showing the quality of their ideas. Yeah, so lack of funding they talk about, but they also talk about, if you don't teach design in school, you kind of already shut out those who are naturally less academic. That our education system at the moment is telling kids that if they don't succeed in certain subjects, then they don't fit the mould, and they're being told that really, really early. And it creates problems later in life as well. So this is a school in Hull where it's actually a pupil referral unit. So it's a school where kids have already been excluded from mainstream education, and they've been sent to this pupil referral unit for learning instead. And they had a bit of area on their site that they could make a classroom on. So they designed this den, which has those individual doors open up in summer, or they can be closed down. And yeah, it's actually, quite a sophisticated thing. It won the Architects Journal People's Choice Award. So again, it was, all of Matt and Fiona's projects are really quality kind of pieces of architecture. And actually talking to Fiona, so far we've all been kind of, it's quite inspiring to see what kids can do, but she wanted to warn that, it's not that they all have amazing ideas, that there are more amazing ideas than adults. She found that the teenagers can be quite closed and conservative. We see hesitancy around their own abilities, she says. So actually, when it came to them being asked to do like individual drawings or coming up individually with ideas, they were really shy, trying to hide away their drawings. But they actually had more confidence when they could work in a group and say, we've proposed this, or we think this is how the outdoor classroom should be. And again, it's probably because we have such an exam-based culture, so kids feel like they're already being judged if they kind of show their own work. So Matt and Fiona's Build projects are about giving young people agency, telling them they have a say in the design of the environment, giving them hands-on skills, the ability to work collaboratively, reaching kids who might be excluded from the current school's context, and then using cultural collaborators. So they, in each of these cases, they have a school with a real brief that kids will end up being the end users of, but they often have to have a third partner who can kind of fund that program, or has an outreach, already has some kind of outreach activity that they can match up. So what she says they're doing now is being more like a kind of matchmaker. They have a really long schools list of people that want to do a build. It's not that people don't want to do builds, they do. It's trying to match them up with different partners. So they worked with the Whitechapel Gallery to fund an art classroom at one school, and also the Institute of Imagination was behind that Maker Lab space in Brixton. So they're finding kind of, they're trying to piece together this puzzle of how to get these builds made. And so you saw the first project was with primary school aged kids, so they believe that design can be taught from a really, really young age. At the moment, we kind of only trust kids to use power tools when they're a certain age, but actually it doesn't have to be like that. Within the correct environment, you can actually get kids making at quite a big scale from quite early on. So the struggles of build. So Fiona mentions, how do you quantify the success of these projects? So if you're trying to show people what a great idea build is, how can you, these are, kids have had their lives impacted by these projects, but it's not always easy to put it into a figure, or, to say, okay, this is, this is how we show value. She did mention that some of the kids who were predicted not to get any GCSEs at all did go on to employment and technical college after working on a build project, but she's hoping to kind of partner up with other institutions who could help her evaluate these projects. And again, of course, it's great for kids to have somebody working with them in such a small group, but this is so rare. They've done maybe 6 or 7 projects, but how could we reach more schools and young people with this approach? And how could they disseminate the knowledge that's been gained through these projects so that it can reach more kids? And then thirdly, I spoke to STORE, who are a kind of association of partners working from architecture and design backgrounds. They were initially sort of using funding from UCL and its widening participation programme. So their initial mission was to kind of take UCL's funding and run summer schools, identify kids who were from schools that were poorly performing but showed some aptitude for art and design and could potentially apply to UCL. So that was initially the job. And then as things went on, so they were doing the summer schools, but then they also found that OneDay Workshops were a good way to kind of teach designs in schools. And these pamphlets are from different sessions that they run as OneDay Workshops. And now they're also running an Afterschool Club in a unit in Coldrops Yard in King's Cross. And they have that space by way of the developer. And kids kind of use it for after-school lessons. They learn to make a product, they sell the product in the shop, and they get to keep the royalties from their sales. So they either invest them back into making more stuff, or they can use them as they wish. It's their product. And they actually are beginning the process of evaluation, because so all these projects, these initiatives kind of popped up around 2016, which is when we first really thought, okay, we are facing a crisis. So you'll notice that 2016 seemed to be a kind of banner year for all these initiatives. And they've just produced a volume, first volume of a book about their OneDay Workshops, where they are starting to now share their outcomes and what they've learned. So again, it was about new materials, processes, confidence, instilling confidence in kids which maybe hadn't had so much exposure to design and technology so far, and then also giving them a flavour of what university education might be like. So the kids previously were quite young. STORE tends to work with kids who are more like 15, 16, deciding what their careers are, maybe deciding whether university is for them or not. So that's the kind of point that they find themselves most useful. So this is a OneDay workshop in Nottingham that was called Melt, and it was about casting pewter. So they kind of learnt to make these utensils to make, they were then used to kind of have this big public barbecue in Nottingham, and these little tools that they made from pewter were used in the barbecue. Again, it's kind of quite not low tech, like still quite involving quite a few processes, but not involving the machinery of a workshop. So this was mostly done outside. So STOR go into schools that are particularly around London, obviously because of their UCL connection. But they say they tend to target Year 12 students who are thinking about higher education the best. And they give information about what it's like to be at university, but they also help kids build up a good portfolio. And one of the associates says a portfolio that we would say is better than any private school students. So this is another of the one thing that they might do on a one-day workshop, and it's about casting concrete into fabric. So again, kind of something that can be done with fairly minimal materials. And that's teaching parametrics with pool noodles at a girls' academy, pool noodle parametrics. So STOR, they found their niche working with older students. They have, I think, 35 associates that they use to kind of deliver their content, either through the one-day workshops, the after-school clubs, or the summer schools. And they also work with, they've just worked with Heatherwick Studio to do a kind of food-themed workshop this summer, so they will also reach out from their network to kind of, depending on what the topic is. So Kevin from STOR noticed that the difference between school-age students and university students is that they are much more open and receptive to exploring ideas. They haven't got such a set path already. They're still quite interested in lots of things. And also the designers, the associates themselves that are involved with STOR find this really rewarding work, but also they get kind of time and resources to explore their own ideas. So a lot of that material testing, casting pewter, casting forming in fabric, those are things that the designers might have wanted to explore anyway. So, you know, it is beneficial. It's not just kind of charitable to do this work. It goes both ways. But then having said that, because they're more, school-age students are more open and receptive to new ideas, they're less focused. It's quite hard to get these kids, especially for the after-school club, to attend regularly. So they might be interested in design and architecture possibly 1 week or two, but to last the whole course is quite difficult. And throughout winter as well. So we have this whole other crisis in the UK of knife crime. So parents are very worried about their kids being out in winter after school in the dark. So to try and get them to the after school club is already a barrier before they've even, you know, tried to even think about studying art and design. Even just to get them out of their houses is a problem. So STOR, because it's kind of got a pop-up nature to it, they know that they need to be more than just a temporary setup if they're going to have real impact. Teachers need to know where they are, kids need to know where they are. To give kids a sense of, you know, that they're going to still be around, they're still going to be, these schools and clubs are still going to be operating in a couple of years. They need to be more than just kind of there 1 minute and not the next. So I think they have a year's lease at Coldrop Yard, which they're looking to extend now with further funding. So they're asking Argent, the developer, to fund them, and also they're looking at external partners who could help them stay at Coldrops and not just be this kind of temporary thing. Again, they rely on the enthusiasm and energy of parents and DT teachers. So DT teachers who know teachers really aren't the problem in this whole scenario. They're really enthusiastic about getting their kids to study design and technology, but they have to kind of literally bus their kids to the workshop after school, and also STOR have to kind of ring up parents to kind of get them to get their kids to these clubs. So, you know, again, these are great solutions, but if they're not part of the curriculum, someone has to do the work of kind of making sure that they're used. And again, because this is UCL, this is a particularly London-specific workshop, but they do work in other cities and they've worked in the kind of London area. But I'm really aware with these whole past 3 initiatives that I've talked about, that they're really only reaching kids in urban areas, in certain areas, and whereas, you know, ideally we want design education to be for every learner in the UK, not just ones who happen to be kind of near these really interesting things that are happening. So to look abroad, to see like what the UK could learn from other countries, which actually I didn't manage to do in the article, because the article for Icon was a kind of London-specific issue. Lots of the people that I spoke to mentioned that Finland has a really good education system for teaching design, a really good education system generally. And they get such great results due to lots of factors. It's not just the fact that design is on the curriculum, it's also to do with that teaching is really valued in Finland. Teachers are quite well paid, it's a less exam-based system, they have long holiday periods and shorter working days. So this is a new school that's been kind of designed in accordance with the changes to the Finnish curriculum. So schools that are more open plan, that encourage kind of not just teaching individual subjects in classrooms, but kind of encourage people to spread knowledge from across different disciplines. So since 2015, the Finnish core curriculum has been reformed to replace subject-based learning with phenomenon-based learning, so that instead of learning economics, geography, maths, they might do a lesson on climate change and then see how all those subjects, thinking and ideas from all those subjects kind of contribute to that topic. So yeah, it's being reflected in the country's architecture as well. So almost 5,000 schools are being redesigned, 100 new schools began construction, and others are being refurbished to become open plans. That was one of the schools that's a new school. And there's a lot of research behind this, that it's University of Helsinki have said that when it comes to real life, our brain is not sliced into disciplines. We're thinking in a very holistic way. And when you think about the problems in the world, global crises, migration, the economy, the post-truth era, we really haven't given our children the tools to deal with this intercultural world. So they're really pioneering in kind of changing 20th century thinking to 21st century thinking. How can we equip children to be able to deal with problems? So the whole Finnish curriculum is quite open-minded, but crafts is also really, has traditionally been part of the Finnish curriculum and is also a really strong part of it now. So woodworking and textile craft has been on the curriculum for 150 years and continues to be, but kids are also learning how to kind of integrate software development and planning projects, aspects of service design. So they're not just learning traditional crafts, they're learning the whole gamut of everything you do in design and technology. All students study craft for the first 7 years of school. And the reasons why it works so well in Finland are also to do with Finnish culture, which we don't have in the UK. So in the UK, we have this very serviced society. We generally don't know how to make and fix things. We would pay other people to make and fix things for us. Whereas possibly one reason that it's so important for Finland is because it's a more rural-based society. So if your roof broke, it would take days for someone to come and fix it for you. You need to know how to fix it yourself. So we have this very, it's great to look at other examples, but we need to find solutions which are going to suit the UK. We can't suddenly become, as crafty as Finnish people. It's also the kind of benefits of teaching crafts or having crafts on the agenda was that it was well-being and relaxation for the kids. So obviously if you're in the classroom all day, that's kind of crafts offers a chance to get out of the classroom and use, you're still learning, but you're learning in a different way. And that kind of had a positive effect on kids. And it actually showed that learning design supports learning other subjects. So while in the UK we're kind of interested in just separating it all out and kind of saying that maths and English are important but design isn't, there is actually evidence that learning design helps you understand, helps your learning of English and maths, because for some kids they find it hard to understand abstract concepts without applying them to some kind of reality. So it's like, pure maths might just be beyond them, but if they can see how they might apply that to a real situation, then they can that can have a positive effect. So it's not just Finland that has a kind of a better crafts-based culture and curriculum than the UK. Japan, New Zealand, Australia and the US also teach woodwork from quite a young age, and it has more of a kind of cultural value than it does here. So this is Beam Camp, which I mentioned before, which was set up which is in New Hampshire in the US, and they have this amazing 2-acre estate full of lakes and forests, and also they have a summer camp culture in the US anyway. So each year I think 80 teenagers go along to this camp. They learn about creativity, they learn about fixing, making, and they also do one big build. So this is their big build from last year, 2018, and it's a bicycle-powered bakery. So that down there, the second little orange wheel is a bike that pedal powers the furnace, and then they bake bread every day. So each year these big builds are a kind of a result of an annual competition. There's international competition, so architects and designers from all over the world can kind of submit their ideas for what they think this big build should be. So Matthew Springett won it in 2016 or 2015, I think, with his idea for like a floating island, I think. And the kids actually build it. And it seems to work really well because, again, it's about teaching hands-on skills, working collaboratively, but also the winning kind of design and the architect that comes over to the US to build it with the kids is this kind of mentor, it's this role model from design, shows the kids that actually being a designer and architect is quite cool and something to aspire to. This is kids in the Netherlands, and there's an institute called the Waag Institute in Amsterdam, which is also thinking about how to improve design education, but in a Dutch context. And part of their work is to do creative learning labs, but also to turn libraries into or introduce maker spaces into libraries. So not replace them, but kind of add a kind of making facility, or at least the kind of machines to make and tinker and invent, putting them in with libraries as part of a public programming exercise. And that, on the picture on the right, is the, I think, 21st one that they've opened in Amsterdam. And they have quite an interesting philosophy that's about technology, but also looking at technology critically. So not just teaching kids to be kind of passive consumers of technology, but to have a kind of engagement with it. I haven't talked too much about the kind of coding and electronic aspect of making so far. I've been concentrating more on kind of crafts-based skills, but because they kind of overlap in this example, it's quite good to include. So they have a public research agenda for 2019 where they talk about a maker mindset. They say learning from a maker perspective is learning through making, connecting our heads and hearts. The lab seeks to spread the insight that technology is not sacred, but made by humans, so as to cultivate active, critical and independent attitudes. So to kind of have this everyday engagement with technology, not just to be a passive consumer of it. And one of the kind of, again, something that is sort of a conversation for a different day, but makerspaces, there's been a whole kind of movement about, it's sort of come out of California to kind of get makerspaces into cities, so create places where people can go and make things, tinker with electronics, invent things. But one of the problems with it is that you can make makerspaces, but if you don't have maker culture and if you don't have kids who are confident to make things, those spaces don't get used. So in China has the biggest number of makerspaces, but at the moment only 30% of them are being used. So there was this big government-backed push in 2015 to kind of get Chinese design to be about making original products, not copying products, and they saw makerspaces as being part of that. But again, because China has a quite exam-orientated education system, and they kind of pushed for, the government wanted to push for mass innovation and in entrepreneurship through making. They didn't really appeal to hobbyists and people who already had some interest in making. The things just didn't connect, and they have now this kind of huge problem with makerspaces being underused. So just to recap, to face the future, the next generation need design education that's introduced early and consistently. So again, we've learnt along the way from the examples that it's never too early to bring design onto the agenda. It's not that it's unsafe, it just needs to be taught creatively. Design education needs to cross disciplines, so there's a difficulty already in teaching it as a subject, but it has real potential to kind of enter this this idea of phenomenon-based learning, and design can be one aspect that applies to lots of different situations. It doesn't have to be taught alone. Design education needs to engender a culture of making and fixing with respect for materials, each other and the environment, and is for every learner. So again, at school age, which is why I wanted to talk about school age education, design really has the potential to reach a lot of people from all different backgrounds. And if you're not learning about design at home, you're not learning about it, you don't have parents that work in design, I don't. School is really the only opportunity for you to engage with design, so it really needs to be there as part of the agenda. So right now we need to find better ways to evaluate the impact of these projects, so in and out of schools. So because this sort of crisis, it has been happening over 20 years, but it's only in the last sort of 4 or 5 that people have initiatives like the ones that I've spoken about have really stepped in to do something. Because they're so new, that it's sort of been too short a time period to actually be able to evaluate them, share the outcomes, to show each other how we could improve. So now's the time to do that. We need to connect up different strands of thinking from science, maths, engineering, art, technology and craft. So again, it's not that people aren't thinking about this problem. Loads of people are, and it's really encouraging. So the V&A has this conference called Innovate, and it has a programme where it sets a national challenge for kids. The Design Museum has Design Ventura, which is again about taking design into schools and getting kids to come up with a product which is then sold in the shop. But it's sort of, and then engineering has its own kind of award schemes and programmes which are purely geared to kind of creating more engineers. So at the moment there are tons of people thinking about this, but we're not really thinking together about how to solve this problem in a effective way that reaches lots of children. So we need to find ways to disseminate knowledge from these projects so we can reach more children in schools. So again, I mentioned that all the examples are really inspiring and fantastic and have had great outcomes, but if you're perhaps in a rural area and you're wanting to learn design and technology, you may never have heard of any of these, and they probably won't be something that reaches you. So we have to make sure that it reaches everybody. And we need to communicate the value of design to a wider audience. So yes, we can talk to politicians and say that it should be on the curriculum, but really we need to speak to everybody. Getting design education on the agenda is going to involve a wider conversation and to really make a change. And then in the future, we need to think about what skills and experience kids need from design education. So again, I mentioned there's a whole set of people who think that design should be on the agenda because we need more designers and entrepreneurs. And then there's another school of thought which is everyone should study design no matter what you're going to go off and do, because it's this holistic approach to learning, and actually design teaching can give us so much more than just the tools to become a designer. It can teach us to be empathetic, collaborative, see things from other people's perspectives, which is so crucial to the problems of the near future. We need to consider how it can fit the practice of design better, which is an ever-changing goal, because design is changing so fast that how can design education really keep up with it? We need to make sure design education remains accessible in a volatile political environment. So we don't even know what's happening with politics week to week at the moment, let alone year to year or decade to decade. So no matter what happens in politics, we need to kind of make sure that design education doesn't fall away, or I mean, education itself is just being used as a kind of political tool at the moment. You know, this government says we're going to fund schools, that one says that we're going to cut funding. So how can we protect design, kind of future-proof it to make sure that it stays on the agenda no matter what happens politically? And maybe that's going to involve universities, cultural organisations, museums, and other partners to find new ways of teaching design. So Fix Ed, which is the kind of think tank behind Fix Berts, is convening a big conference session early next year to kind of get lots of these thinkers together in a room to say, you know, what ways exist for teaching design, but also what ways are unexplored, what could we put on the table to kind of meet some of these demands that aren't already there. And that's it. So thank you. Thanks for